Hello APUSHers, this is Mr. Rains, and in today's video, we are going to be looking at the essentials, the top 5 must-knows for Period 4. Of course, this will not substitute for you doing your readings, paying attention in class, and taking good notes. But if you are looking for a quick review of Period 4, then you've come to the right place. So let's get started. With our number 1 must-know for Period 4, it's Jefferson. The election of 1800 is often referred to as the Revolution of 1800. Why, you might ask? Well, it is because we will see a change of political parties. Both President Washington and President Adams were Federalist. However, Thomas Jefferson will win this election in 1800, and he belonged to a different party, the Democratic Republicans. Now, this will be a revolution unlike any other, because there will be a peaceful transfer of power from one party to the next party. And Jefferson's ideas will usher in what became known as Jeffersonian democracy, because Jefferson believed that he represented the voices of the common man, and he had a vision of an agrarian society and a political system that included the voices of average Americans and farmers. However, his extension of democracy wouldn't quite include groups like African Americans, women, or Native Americans. But Jeffersonian democracy was a call to limit the scope of the government's power. Jefferson will do this by repealing the Alien and Sedition Acts, which had been signed by President Adams. And he will remove all internal taxes on U.S. citizens, including the despised whiskey tax. Now, Jefferson promised the American people that he would strictly follow the Constitution as president, and he would work to keep America out of all foreign conflicts. However, this would prove more difficult than Jefferson had envisioned, and he would have to compromise these ideals. In Tripoli, Jefferson would authorize the use of military force against Barbary pirates. And when an opportunity came up for Jefferson to purchase the Louisiana Territory from France, he took it, even though the idea that a president can purchase land wasn't strictly stated in the Constitution. And when Americans faced trouble at sea, President Jefferson signed the Embargo Act, cutting off American trade and stifling our young economy. This would avoid war with England, but at what cost? Now let's move on to our number 2, the era of good feelings. The time period following the War of 1812 is called the era of good feelings. Well, what makes this period so good? Well, there was a spirit of nationalism during this time, where Americans were proud to be Americans. For the first time, literature and art was more American-centered. And there was an effort to rebuild the capital city to be bigger and better than ever. Henry Clay's American system encouraged the growth of roads, canals, and even railroads to build up our new nation. And this would be a period where one political party, the Democratic Republicans, dominated control of our government. However, everything was not all good during the era of good feelings. The Panic of 1819 was the first peacetime financial crisis in American history. But even more concerning was the growing sectionalism that was developing in our country, dividing the North and South. Though Americans were certainly proud to be Americans, they were equally as proud of their particular region of the country. And these differences between the North and South will eventually spill over into multiple conflicts. The Missouri Compromise was an attempt to solve the conflict between the North and South. But this compromise actually made the divide even more obvious, as an imaginary line was drawn across the former Louisiana Territory at the 3630 North Parallel, establishing a boundary between free and slave regions. The Missouri Compromise did resolve the issue of slavery, but only temporarily. When it came to foreign policy, America also drew a line. This time the line would be between the United States and Europe. President Monroe made a bold proclamation when he said The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European power. This Monroe Doctrine became a cornerstone of American foreign policy and a threat to European powers to stay out of the Americas. Now on to number 3, antebellum reforms. The Second Great Awakening was a series of Christian revivals that spread throughout the United States. Christians across the country began hosting outdoor church services known as camp meetings to spread the faith and influence. But what was unique about many of these meetings was the fact that minorities and women were often present and sometimes even encouraged to speak, sing, and participate in these religious services. Not only that, but many sermons were focused on how Christians should take an active role in improving society. Therefore, the Second Great Awakening marks the beginning of major social reform movements. These reforms are often known as the antebellum reforms, or before the Civil War, including education, prison reform, women's rights, abolition, and temperance. Our number 4 must know: the market revolution. The new transportation projects, plus the rise of factories in the North, led to what became known as the market revolution. Better transportation meant easier movement of people and goods, improved trade, and solidification of the North's role as the commercial center of our nation. The market revolution meant that America was now connected and could easily travel, buy, and sell. Turnpikes, canals, and last but not least, railroads linked the North to the rest of the country. The market was thriving, but the life of factory workers was far from easy. Conditions were so bad that these workers were often referred to as wage slaves. They worked long hours for low wages and often dangerous conditions. But because of the market revolution, more goods were now available and more affordable for the average American. Number 5, Jackson. Andrew Jackson, the famous war hero from the War of 1812, was elected president in 1828. Jackson's election, though, marked the end of the era of good feelings. Just like Jefferson, the presidency of Andrew Jackson is often referred to as Jacksonian democracy. Jackson would fight for the expansion of the franchise or right to vote to include more people. Nearly all white men could vote in the United States under President Jackson. Just like Jefferson, Jackson, there is an appeal to the common man and a reaction against the rich elite. However, the common man still referred to white males. The major issues that defined the Jackson presidency were the nullification crisis, the bank war, and Indian removal. Jackson supported states' rights, but as president, of course, it was a little more complicated. Tariffs, you might remember, were taxes that became incentives for people to buy American products and not foreign ones. However, Southerners opposed the tariffs as they felt it was a means to get them to buy more expensive goods made in the North. Remember the sectional division between the North and South? Well, it's only growing. Many Southerners called the new tariff the Tariff of Abominations, and the Vice President of the United States, who was from South Carolina, suggested that Southern states use the concept of nullification to avoid paying the tariff. Jackson, who did support states' rights in theory, but now that he's president, saw this idea of nullification as an attack against him and his authority. And so President Jackson threatened to invade the state of South Carolina with a force bill to force them to pay the tariff. Henry Clay stepped in with a compromised tariff, of course, Henry Clay, which lowered the cost and temporarily calmed the tensions between the North and South. Another major issue for Jackson was that of the national bank. To Jackson, the bank symbolized greed and corruption, that this was an institution not in the Constitution and therefore not even chosen by the American people. So when Congress proposed a bill to renew the charter of the bank, Jackson vetoed and killed the bank. He had done what Jefferson had never been able to do. However, the result on the economy was initially not so good. Inflation spread and the value of the dollar went down. Now finally, Jackson takes significant action against Native Americans. Native Americans had been an obstacle to the American government since colonial times. Disease, war, treaties, and relocation unfortunately became the story of Native Americans. There was an effort by the United States government to assimilate the natives. This is an attempt to strip them of their culture and make them adopt American culture. Many tribes did just that, including the Cherokee. Many natives became Christians and adopted American farming lifestyle. 5 tribes were even classified by the American government as civilized tribes, and they were granted land through multiple treaties. However, when the Georgia farmland became desirable by Americans, Americans began to intrude on the Cherokee land. Rather than fight in a violent way, the Cherokees addressed the issue like Americans would, through the courts. And in Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court sided with the Cherokees, claiming they had a right to the land. However, President Jackson had little taste for Native Americans and refused to enforce the court's ruling. John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. As you know, though, it's the job of the executive branch, the president, to enforce laws, not the Supreme Court. Yet Jackson was blatantly defying checks and balances that were intended to be followed by the Founding Fathers. Ultimately, Jackson would sign the Indian Removal Act, which would force the natives from their lands. The Cherokees' trip from Georgia to their reservation became known as the Trail of Tears and marks a dark blot on the U.S. country's history. Opponents of Jackson, which there were many, labeled him King Jackson because Jackson used his veto power more than any previous president. He challenged the Supreme Court, refused to enforce orders, and to many, Jackson was seen as a bully. Okay, that's it. That was number 5. That is our top 5 for period 4. Leave a comment below, and if you've benefited from these videos, remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time for period 5.